You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Hello, everybody. My name is Bob Keane. I'm the editor-in-chief of the internationally renowned journal Fire Ecology, a scientific journal that's published by Springer Nature and supported by the Association for Fire Ecology, AFE. We're very proud of the journal, and today we have a great show for you in that we've got three people talking about this paper. Seed maturation and mortality patterns support non-serotinous conifer regeneration mechanisms following high-severity fire. I'd like you to welcome Madeleine Lopez, Jeff Kane, and David Greene. Maddie, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Maddie. I'm a professor at College of the Redwoods in Forestry and Natural Resources.
And David, you're up next.
David Greene. I'm a professor at Cal Poly Humboldt. I teach about fire.
And this next person, I don't think needs an introduction, but he is a critical cog in the journal in that he's one of our very important associate editors, Jeff Kane. Jeff, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Bob. Jeff Kane. I'm from Cal Poly Humboldt in the Department of Forestry, Fire, and Rangeland Management, and we're up in Northern California.
I surely appreciate you guys coming and talking about your paper. I think it's a great paper. It sure was thought-provoking for me. Maddie, why don't you give us the nutshell of what the paper's all about?
Yeah, so in this publication, we work to characterize a non-serotinous conifer regeneration mechanism termed conditional pyrесcence. And so we're looking at, non-serotinous conifers that are found in landscapes prone to high severity fire. And, we're wondering how in the world have these guys been able to persist on the landscape following these high severity events. And so we were able to do that by identifying the timing of seed maturation for these California conifers. From there, we looked at identifying the threshold for seed mortality. So trying to understand the levels of heat that these guys could withstand prior to mortality. And from there, we tied it all together by overlaying the timing of wildfire to figure out the temporal window that permits for conditional pyrесcence.
Yeah, it was an incredibly interesting and important concept in fire ecology in that it seems like that type of theory can be used across the world. So, David, can you expand and talk about this whole idea of conditional pyrесcence?
Everybody knows what serotiny is. You have a very large crop on the tree. It represents multiple cohorts. And so a fire can occur at any time of the summer, and there will be ample seeds available deep within a large severe patch available for regeneration. By contrast, non-serotinous species, we typically think of as having to come in from the green edge. And because of dispersal limitations, all of our studies of post-fire regeneration show that distance from seed source is a major factor in explaining local density. The other thing we know from all these retrospective studies is that moisture condition, soil moisture, is also important. A droughty year is going to lead to a lower density of recruits than a wet summer. But one thing we never focus on, almost never, is seed production. And in the case of what's going on at the time of the fire, the seed crop at the time of the fire, the evidence remains on the forest floor for several years after the fire. Any cone that had been produced the year before the fire was consumed by smoldering combustion. And therefore, you can know the seed availability just by looking at the forest floor several years later. Every one of those cones has to be from the year of the fire. That's one of the main points we're trying to make, is that in understanding post-fire recruitment, we need to focus not just on soil moisture and severe patch size, but also on the quality of the cone production, the quality of the crops. And just one last thing for those who don't know, in non-serotinous species, the size of the cone crop varies enormously from year to year. It's feast or famine. It's driven by weather variables in the preceding 2 summers before the crop.
Yeah, that's the take-home message I get from the paper, David, is that serotiny isn't conditional pyrесcence. Conditional pyrescence is much, much larger than serotiny. So thanks for that. Jeff, what do you think the implications of this paper are for both management and research?
Part of our curiosity about this, or what motivated this project, was that we were going out, especially in lodgepole pine forest, and seeing lots of regeneration after the fire. And if folks know, the lodgepole in California is non-serotinous. So we were trying to really understand, why is that possible? And so our paper kind of demonstrates this mechanism. Where we think it's really important is that this can happen in any fire-prone landscape that experiences high-severity fire. So if what we think is true, then we can see that it can happen happen in lots of different places, but there is some places where it might be less evident. And so I'm thinking of like the Southwest and like Arizona and New Mexico, where they tend to have fires that occur much earlier. And so their seeds in non-serotinous cones, the seeds aren't going to be as mature when the fires occur. So we would expect to not see this mechanism as often. And the other thing is that we see in most post-fire regeneration studies, post-fire regeneration is hugely variable. In a lot of places, you won't have any regen, but in some areas, you'll have like thousands of seeds per acre. And so we wanted to know, like, how is that possible? And so this is one way to do that. And as far as I know, the mechanism we demonstrate isn't built into any of the post-fire models. So if managers want to be able to try to understand and predict where these events might occur, they really don't have the tools to do it. So our hope is that, this research will kind of progress that ability to model these somewhat rare but important events.
Which makes it well worth reading for anybody who's interested in this. I am really interested in this whole idea of conditional pyrесcence. Maddie, do you want to expand on a little more, the evidence in the literature and so on?
Absolutely. Thanks, Bob. When we think about non-serotinous conifer regeneration patterns, we expect that these guys are going to be reseeding from the living edge, meaning that they're relying on those living trees on the edge of the patch for these high severity, large burn patches. And we expect for there to be quite a bit of recruitment closer to those live trees. And as you reach the interior portions of the burn patch, recruitment is going to become quite a bit lower. Now, you can imagine as those patches increase in size with these larger high severity patches, there's quite a concern here, right? Like, how are we going to be able to restock the interior portions? We've seen from Greene and Johnson back in 1989 that recruitment becomes quite limited beyond 100 meters following that living edge and flattens out quite a bit around 200 meters. So interestingly enough, one of my favorite publications in Larson and Franklin back in 2005, they documented this incredibly dense patch of recruitment of Douglas fir following the Warner Creek burn in Oregon in 1991. And you can see that this patch is several hundred meters away from the nearest living Douglas fir. And what you see is this image where they have snapped, from the middle of this severe patch, this just incredibly dense pocket of Douglas fir saplings. And so, we're like, how could this be possible? And we've also noted this as well with the Engelmann spruce when it coincided with a mass deer. Poundin et al. In 2014 documented a similar occurrence where there was a dense patch of regeneration for Engelmann spruce. This has also been documented a couple other times with Rocky Mountain lodgepole pine in Turner et al.'s work, 2019, which is a non-serotinous pine. And then again with the Sierra lodgepole pine. And really quick too, one thing I just want to note is that the Rocky Mountain lodgepole pine is a really interesting species where early on in its life, it expresses non-serotinous cones. And as it begins to age, that's when it starts to express these serotinous cones. And so the timing of fire did coincide when it had an expression of non-serotinous cones. And from there, we were seeing these dense patches of regeneration. Again, a similar occurrence with the Sierra lodgepole pine following a reburn event. And this is documented in Harris et al. 2021. This really gave us evidence and some fuel, no pun intended, to investigate this mechanism a bit further.
That's very cool. Very nice. So, David, what kind of follow-up activities or research do you think you got planned for this?
Some of it's straightforwardly follow-up. For example, we just had a fire last summer, and it occurred just as the seeds of ponderosa pine and white fir were beginning to mature. Now we're at the point where we get to make predictions. I'm going to go out there next week, now the snow's gone, and check. I don't expect there to be very good regeneration, despite there having a very good clone crop, because it was early in the summer that the fire occurred. The paper is about first part of this window of opportunity, the seed maturation schedule. We have a follow-up paper where we've combed the literature for everything we can find on seed abscission schedules, because seed abscission is what closes the window. Once the seeds are on the ground, if a fire occurs, those seeds are lost. They're going to be consumed by smoldering. This second paper will then allow us to give the audience a much better sense of this window, how it increases in size over the summer, maximizing in probably late August, early September, and then begins to decline as cones empty of seeds.
Yeah, that's amazing that all these things can go on afterwards. That's great. So, Jeff, are there anything special about the methods or about the results that you want to talk about?
Sure, yeah. The methods we used, it's pretty involved in that we had to track the maturation of seeds over time. So you collect these cones every, couple weeks or month and then test them for viability to develop that maturation curve. But as I mentioned before, this is something that can be done elsewhere. So it has a lot of utility in other places. And what we think is that this is a mechanism that is probably more common than is currently realized and probably will help us in understanding the more complex patterns of post-fire regeneration.
Great, thanks. So, Maddie, back to you. Let's talk about anybody you want to recognize, funding agencies, co-authors, field techs, or whatever.
Absolutely. First, to start with funding, we'd like to thank McIntyre Stennis for their grant, as well as California Native Plant Society. The North Coast chapter also afforded a financial opportunity, as well as the Northwest Scientific Association. And lastly, the Dillard Bailey Graduate Scholarship, all of which allowed for us to do this work today. And I also just want to thank some of my incredible field assistants that stuck with me for several seasons, oftentimes doing work out of the goodness of their heart. So for that, I'd like to thank Grace Rhodes as well as Raul Barajas Ramirez. And there were some other folks as well that just contributed quite a bit of encouragement and their time as well.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you, David, Jeff, and Maddie, for coming on and doing the podcast. Very incredibly, very interesting paper. Really appreciate it. Listeners, if you want to get this paper, guess what? You can get it for free at our journal website. These people have already paid the freight for that article. You get it for free, and you can download it at any time you want from our website. I'd like to thank you three again and invite all of you listeners to come back and listen to our next Fire Ecology Chat.
Thank you for listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our show and leave us a review. To learn more about fire ecology and support our future work by becoming a member, visit fireecology.org. FIREECOLOGY.org.